to the very last part of our workshop. Feel free to begin.
So my first question is for Harris, and Harris said right?
Yeah, it's fine.
And it's about, so I was wondering if you could delve a little on the differences between sort of the accounts that Plato has on ethics, on the text that you mentioned, in comparison to his perspective on the symposium. I don't know.
Sorry, his perspective on?
That he writes about on the symposium.
Oh. Okay.
If there are any differences or not.
Mm-hmm. I always write questions down because they're very useful for. So yeah, that's an interesting question to explore the views that Plato had throughout his different dialogues. So symposium is obviously extremely important with respect to what's usually called the Diotima speech and the first and the second. How do they call it? I'm not sure about the English word. Descent towards the intellectual. So one aspect that is extremely important here is what Diotima says about creativity and about, so there is this famous line which begins with, all men are pregnant, Socrates, but some men are pregnant in their souls and some men are pregnant in their bodies. So usually how this is usually interpreted is like the notion of creativity and the fact that those people who are pregnant in their souls are in a way aspiring towards different kinds of creations. Now, with the concrete wording, Diotima and the others usually use notions like theories and laws. So idea being that those who are in a good way pregnant in their souls can give rise to good theories, so this would account for sciences and arguably philosophers, and to good laws, which applies to the policymakers. It's not so much that arts are being mentioned here, but somehow we tend to think that because this creativity is also related to the arts, the idea here is that Diotima is very aware, so to say, about the importance of arts and the fact that arts are kind of related to this, let's say, intellectual sphere where the true beauty resides, or truer beauty than the one that is directly visually available to humans. So in that sense, symposium, I think, matters because it kind of the interesting aspect is the way in which Diotima puts forward this idea that it is the state of human beings that they are pregnant that is creative, and that what gives meaning to their lives is the capacity to create. And obviously she doesn't think highly of creation of other human beings. She even has this famous sentence where she basically says, you never see someone being given a statue for the fact that he gave birth to a child, or that he, let's say, created a child, but we do create statues for those who came up with wonderful theories and wonderful laws. So this would be the idea that these kind of scientific / artistic practices are of much greater importance to Diotima than these other kinds of. But obviously it does relate to human capacity to create, although it's hard to see how Plato doesn't really, or Socrates don't really comment on that. But then on the other hand, what interpreters tend to emphasize is the fact that Symposium can be read almost as a literary work of art. Some would even say literary masterpiece. Given the beauty of language, given like different speeches, they all have certain aesthetic qualities, and there is the story about the better half, the I'm not sure how to pronounce the word in English, but the tragic poet as Helicus, or I don't know, do you know how his name is pronounced? But basically the story that we were once perfect and then God separated us. So on his view, the ultimate condition of humanity is the condition of suffering and longing and always feeling incomplete. So this is one perspective on life, which is then kind of contrasted to Diotima's notion of creativity and the capacity that each of us have to kind of deliver something good to the world. So I think Symposium would be one of those dialogues that critics of Plato tend to kind of point to and say, look, for a guy who is very dismissive of aesthetic qualities, this dialogue shows that he was in fact extremely poetic type. and that he actually did rely on aesthetic force of language to convey his idea. So it's a very interesting dialogue. I think I like to teach it. I like the ideas that it has. So I'm glad that you brought it up. Thank you.
That reminds me of the discussion we had yesterday with the girl presenting the painting. It's characteristic of this. There's no aesthetic concern. She defined this through several blah blah blah. And what about if that is the aesthetic concern? There is a concern about the look of things. Anyway, but okay. You are something else to highlight.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Go
So I guess here, since you're already talking, I'll ask some questions for you. But I have a question for Monica later. Yeah, so I think you're right that a lot of questions or views that people are forming even now in philosophy of art in some way can be traced back to Plato's concerns, so that Plato, or philosophy being put under Plato. I think that it seems right that people are influenced, whether they know it or not, by ideas from Plato and contemporary philosophy. But I don't know what you think about, like, whether that is a possible limitation of their approach in contemporary philosophy to even sort of accepting a framework from how they're reading Plato. Because what I was thinking is that, not a Plato expert obviously, but Plato, not only are there complications involved in him writing in the dialogue form, where it's not clear what are his views, what are Socrates' views, whether he's even aiming with his dialogues, or with some dialogues and not others, to eventually point the reader to something like a theory that he would endorse, rather than just engaging in sort of an exercise in dialectic and thinking that there's value in that. And so, aside from those complications, I'm also thinking that even if he is giving an answer that he endorses in a particular dialogue to some question about art, what exactly the question or problem is that he was addressing in that dialogue seems to be important. So, for example, in the Ion, it seems that he was very likely, and again, I'm not a Plato expert, so I don't know for sure, but I think I remember reading things and suggesting, like, he was very likely responding specifically to people at the time, I guess they would be counted as sophists, who were presenting Homer as the source of moral education and as authoritative. So if what he's trying to do in that dialogue with his skepticism about the value of art is not make a sort of universal point about art itself that stands for all time, but is just almost refuting those people who wanted to claim this value in Homer, or wanted to use Homer in this way. I think that might be limiting for how, because if people are influenced, consciously or not, by Plato in what they're doing in contemporary philosophy, that would seem only to be justified if we take Plato to be trying to make a universal general claim about art, rather than saying something about art in response to a specific problem of his time that he was addressing. And similarly in the Republic, if the idea is that if you imagine an ideal or perfect social arrangement, then in the context of that arrangement, you would have to limit children's early exposure to art so that they would develop virtue first. And then I think I remember he says something like, well, the guardians, once they're educated, they'll be properly positioned to be able to engage with and appreciate art. There's no danger of it harming them anymore because they're... So it's not clear if he would have even said that this censoring of art, even for children, was, like, in exactly the way he described it, was important to do in real life in Greece at the time, or again, like, generally as a universal claim throughout other places, because he might just be saying, if you're going to have this perfect social arrangement, then this would need to be part of it. Again, you mentioned part of that idea in the Republic of the perfect society is everyone having a single role or function. And so again, that might be a claim that's limited to this ideal society, and it doesn't follow that Plato would have said that in everyday Athens at the time that it's better for people to only restrict themselves only to one thing. So with all of those complications, both like the context that Plato was presenting a view as a response to, it was almost like the problem he was trying to solve by presenting a view. If that would limit the relevance of ideas we find in Plato for contemporary discussions of art. And then, so I'm not going to say much more, but that kind of goes hand in hand with the related question of whether what Plato understood the arts to be, even what Plato's understanding of literature was, that seems to be very different from what we understand, even within a particular art form like literature, which probably hasn't changed as much as, say, visual art has. If that would also be a limitation on taking what he said to be a universal claim or view that would apply today, if it even applies to what we are talking about when we talk about art.
Thank you. These are great sets of questions and definitely of crucial importance for, let's say, the framework within which I'm working on it. So, of course, and I didn't want to spend too much time on this notion. When I was giving the talk, I was kind of assumed that it was rather familiar and I wanted to cover something else, but you're absolutely right. The conception of art that Plato had in mind was much poorer than we have it today. So it's certainly questionable whether his views would cover some of the, let's say, notions or some of the frameworks which we employ today, 18th century forward. So in that sense, you are absolutely right. I should have probably been more cautious with respect to how I was presenting his views. And of course, many people would argue that on the one hand, Plato was kind of frustrated by the fact that he failed as a poet, so that his anger, if that's the proper word, that his anger was actually directed at those who succeeded, that he kind of wanted to trash them, not because they were somehow problematic, but because he failed. Then there are also those who wanted to say that it wasn't that he was so much angry at the arts, but he just wanted to create a space for philosophy, and the best way he saw, or the best way to do that, as he understood it, was to get rid of the arts because of this cultural and educational significance that mythology in particular had. So there's obviously very different elements that we should consider in approaching it. And of course, as I just said, the fact that he himself uses not only poetic language, but also dialogues, which can also be seen as dialectical kind of ways of, and also something that is found in literary forms, and also that he was using so much symbolism and metaphors, the cave and the Gilgamesh, the ring of the invisibility. So that he was using so many literary devices shows that he couldn't have seriously believed that there was something wrong with the educational aspect of art. However, that somehow I'm less concerned with that because, again, I'm not, as you said, I'm not a Plato scholar, so my aim here is not to present his theory as such. What I was really kind of surprised when I was going through all of this contemporary stuff is just how much of that seemed to be at least anticipated by Plato. And then it seemed to me that some of the problems that we are facing, but also some of the findings, like these empirical findings that somehow do show that even with these limitations, as you nicely put it, that we still can take his views to be somehow relevant. And I always want to show that philosophers had it right all along, I guess. So I kind of really wanted to use this to show that we are still struggling with these very questions, and that Plato was actually very well aware of just how important they are. And because it seems to me that our artistic traditions have really been kind of characterized by them. So many great poets throughout the history and intellectuals, when they were writing about art, it seems to me they always kind of had this Plato's criticism in the background. So it seems to me that it's still very, very much alive. although of course it can be changed. But also, I guess one reason why I think that although we operate with different understanding of art, it's not techne, it's something, whether Collingwood, whether, but we definitely do operate with a different concept. It seems to me that the core of the problem, and that is the fact that through observation of a play or of a movie or through reading a literary work, it really does an impact on our epistemic and ethical agency. It seems to me that this aspect is permanent. Maybe because in literature, which is my main field, is perhaps, independently of the genre or literary period, it seems to me that Plato's principles are always present. There is always a character that can get you in the wrong direction, or a character that can get you in the right direction, right? So in that sense, whether it is techne, whether it is mimeticism, whether it is expressionist, I don't think that makes much of a difference for what I am interested in. But I also want to suggest that Plato did not appreciate it truly, but it could be because for them it wasn't an artistic achievement. There was nothing in that sense valuable, right? The art with capital A, it was just a techne. So it could be that he wasn't, at least in these dialogues, right? There are many other dialogues where he's kind of expressing his appreciation of the skills that go into this particular technique. So yeah, but I would still kind of suggest that regardless of all of these limitations, obviously his theory cannot be directly applied, but I think it can still give us a very useful framework on how to approach these topics.
Yeah, in relation to that and to the response to that question, I have also a tiny bit of question. Because in your two last conclusions, you kind of bring this view of Plato's criticism into the contemporary framework of our contact with art. And I'm thinking that maybe the problem with this criticism is the way that it is way too radical when approaching art, because even though we have a different definition of art as Plato did, the problem seems to be that all art contains these willful elements. But we could, and it is wrong to insist upon censorship, paternalism, and everything else, but we could have kind of different contexts for the way we evaluate these works of art in a general way. So it doesn't seem wrong to me that a certain work of art can be presented in this kind of censored and paternalistic way, as you mentioned with the trigger warnings before a film containing or the age ratings or anything. So maybe the scope of Plato's criticism is the one thing that is wrong about it and not it itself. So, because I do believe that when presenting some work of art, it has to be contextualized in order for the especially the ethical, I think the psychological and epistemological elements too, but especially for the ethical elements to be kind of explained or weighed out in a different fashion than it is in the artwork. So that's the reason why we, in the history of a certain art form, we can have artworks that we shouldn't ethically agree with, like the movies from the 1910s, like the racist movies and stuff like that. But we can evaluate them in the certain context that we are only paying attention to, like the aesthetic qualities of it, not to the elements of the content that are actually problematic. So in this way, I feel like Plato's criticism is a very good view to have today, like you propose, as it's very good to re-evaluate it, but only with this difference in scope, maybe not applied to all art and not applied at all times. It's more of a comment than a question. Yeah.
No, thank you for that, because I absolutely agree. I wouldn't censor anything, I think, and there are some philosophers, I think James Carroll has this idea that on the one hand we should caution people and then leave it up to them whether or not they want to engage with a work which is potentially kind of corruptive or dangerous, which could leave you. I also think that we should be more, and this is probably under the influence of Martha Nussbaum, however trivial that becomes, because everyone is kind of influenced by her in this respect. But the idea that our literary classes, so those, and arguably film classes, and depending on how much arts education you have in educational system, that it should be more closely combined to the ethical system, to the ethical theories, and that more attention should be given to the ethical elements. From my experience, at least in my country, people who teach literature are very dismissive of that. They abhor the thought that literary works can engage with philosophy or something like that. It's like, no, that's just a wrong approach to them. So it seems to me sometimes there is this rather strong dismissal of the view that this is the kind of proper way in which to engage with literature. And of course, it's very hard to find balance between using a work in ethical purposes or for purposes of ethical education and discussing it for its artistic values. I think the best approach should be one which encompasses both. But then, of course, the question becomes, how are we to understand the relationship between ethics and aesthetics? And for some people, they can be very clearly separated. It's autonomism, the two have absolutely no relation. Then, of course, there are the views, which is probably where most people think that there is some relation. So if the work is a little bit on the moral side, it can still be aesthetically valuable. But let's say if it's very corruptive or it's very triumph of the will, it's usually the crucial example. Then you simply cannot appreciate it in any way. But for Plato, I think why for Plato this is problematic. And again, like David says, I'm not a Plato scholar. But I've read some work which suggests that the problem is with the particular understanding or translation of the word kalon, which is usually related to the artistic beauty and artistic achievement and aesthetic beauty. But there are some interpreters who think that kalon is like a general idea which can then have its ethical and its aesthetic meaning. And this is apparently what Plato, the way in which you understand Plato's theory of musical education into laws, depends on whether you take kalon to be only those forms of beauty which are simultaneously including ethical and aesthetic elements, or whether you keep them apart. Now, if you keep them together, I think that explains Plato's, as you mentioned, radicality, the radical element in Plato's censorship and criticism. If you think they can be apart, then obviously there's room for the kind of, I think, more easygoing approach and more admissive approach to problematic works within the public sphere.
Thank
you.
Yeah. So it is only two clarifications to Yiddish. So, the first question is the curiosity. Do you see some relations between this ethical impact of art that you develop in relation to art with some contemporary theories like Linda Zabzewski? She has a book on moral exemplarism, the role of models in learning, and so on. Do you see some relations between Plato approach to ethics and what Linda Zabzewski has done in his recent papers and so on? That is the first curiosity, and if you have some things to say about that. And second question is the relation between the ethical impact and cognitivism. Because I think I'm inclined to accept the following: if art has some ethical impact, it seems that art is cognitive. For me, that conditional makes sense. Is intuitive from you. What do you think about that kind of conditional?
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting. Both questions are great. Thank you. So Linda Saksevsky has this interesting theory that we learn to be better by observing moral exemplars, right? And recently, and this is obviously very close to what Plato had in mind when he was talking about the proper characters that poets should emulate. So only those who are virtuous, only those who are courageous, those who don't give up to their sexual urges, etc., etc. So it seems to me there's quite, I would suggest, but I'm not sure I can yet defend this properly, but I would suggest that for him, we really do learn from the role models, from the fictional characters who can serve as our role models. And lately, this theory has been quite popular within film scholars. So a year ago, Karl Plantinga edited this amazing book. It's called, I don't know what it's called, sorry. But there are several authors in that book who are suggesting that we approach fictional characters as role models, and the way in which they are portrayed can, whether through identification, as Monica suggests, or whether through some other means, that they can serve as exemplars for the kind of behavior that is good. Because on this view, what happens is that you don't need to be morally superior, but what literature does, it shows you how different kinds of behavior and different kinds of principles are either socially rewarded or socially punished. So you get to see directly what happens if I do this. This is the punishment, or this is the reward. And then Noel Carroll has also one of his recent papers is about the way in which he doesn't go, because he doesn't believe in identification, but he does believe that there are certain kind of depictions of human actions which inspire admiration in the audience, right? And then he has this long analysis of the emotion of admiration and fascination and what it is that this is actually doing. So his example is The Little Women, and the way in which one of the characters, I always forget her name, one of these characters is kind of going against patriarchy, going against the established norms and fighting for her beliefs, etc., etc. So as Carol sees it, when you read that, you can be so taken in and you can admire this character as to really try to emulate her behavior in your day-to-day life. But then, of course, the problem with that, and he is aware of that, is that you can also feel fascinated with wrong kind of models. I'm not sure what Zaksevsky would say about that.
Yeah, she talks about bad models as well. And she appeals to critical thinking to distinguish between models. We need to have thinking and reflect, thinking about what is a good model and a bad model.
In my own work, not that I presented it here, but I'm currently developing this theory about the cognitive value of anti-hero series. And because for many people who deal with this topic, they argue that the problem with anti-heroes is that they do inspire fascination. You know that what they are doing is wrong, but you're so fascinated by the fact that they are not constrained by the law, by the norms, and this can be very empowering to people, even at the level of physicality. So in that sense, the role model element comes forward, and I think this is extremely, this is how I think for very young children, the young children's literature is based on the idea of role model. So it's definitely one of the crucial segments to explore if we are talking about epistemic education at the level of children. As for the second question, I absolutely agree with you. In order, this is actually Barris's God claim, the causal question, right? If there is any kind of impact, you have to presuppose that art is cognitively valuable, which is why I find Plato's criticism so weird in a sense. At one point he's so aware that we might get wrong models, and because of that he's diminishing the epistemic and you have to, in a way, you have to present faulty things because people are emotional, irrational, sexual, deviant in their behavior. So it's Thank you.
I would like to ask two questions. So I'm wondering, what do you think about two possible internal criticisms of Plato's criticism of art? So the first one, I think that his epistemological criticism of art, that is doesn't follow from his theory of forms. Because an artwork, for example, a figurative painting, a painting of a chair or a bed, what was the example in the 10th book of the Republic, it's actually closer to the forms because of the cognitive content than the real chair. I don't know, and probably there is also a form of an artwork, or maybe form why, if there is a form of a chair, there should be a form of an artwork, or form of painting, or form. I don't know how this follows from his theory of forms. That is the first question. But the second question, educational value of art. So if art has this capacity to harm people, if influence of art can be harmful, it could be also beneficial. Just think about Plato's understanding of human intellect. It's a neutral power, right? So, and maybe benefits of art are even higher than, bigger than benefits from philosophy. So just think about his definitions of virtues. That is a philosophical knowledge, right? What you can learn as a human being from those definitions in this sub-framework of virtue ethics. Not much, but from good examples from the literature, it's a virtual experience. And I think that here art can be even more beneficial than philosophy.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you, and I think that he wasn't in a way aware. I think he was so focused on this imitation and identification that he kind of failed to realize these whole other elements that art gives us, that is not exhausted in what people do, but it is exhausted in precisely this kind of knowledge that we could gain, but that he kind of just doesn't pay attention to in a way. It is questionable why he would just ignore. But again, it probably has to do with his desire to establish philosophy as the main principle, as the main educational principle, which is, if you think about it, so interesting that nowadays people who are criticizing philosophy for its failure to reach these answers or whatever are actually using very similar arguments that he was using against art. So basically philosophy in a way failed to meet the standards that he established for philosophy a long time ago. And arguably, it could be so that if he was more sensitive to art's contributions, and if he had the view of the two united, it could work out better for both. And as for the first question, it's interesting. Many people are actually pointing to this idea that it's hard to understand his theory of art precisely because we don't properly know how to understand his theory of forms. So, and many people share your intuition that, you know, if anything, then art gives us even better insight into the true ideas, because they give you, because unlike the particular chair, as you mentioned, the artist is not guided by, he's actually more guided by the idea. Then there is also the question of how precisely to understand and at which level of development of his theory, because apparently at one point, the theory of forms or the perfect ideas is supposed to only take into consideration abstract notions, character virtues, you know, justice, bravery, stuff like that. It is only afterwards, apparently, that he also has this idea that every chair has its, and then you have to wonder, well, what would be the idea? Is it the idea of perfect art, or if perhaps if each individual has to do? Each individual artwork also has it, so it's very hard to understand. And I do agree with you that if you take into consideration his theory of form, then his entire criticism is kind of much more complicated and kind of loses its grounding, I would say.
And that proportion, more physical, more material, less intellectual. It's
that's
not very solid.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, I have now two question for Monica was going to put first, but maybe it's a question for you, for Iris, makes sense in this sequence right now. So let's see if I can put it properly. So, okay, it connects with with David's remark. There is no discussion in Plato to be found, a theory of, okay, here is a technique. The mimetic, the mimetic arts are litigation. So, but there is no discussion. Okay, image makers or verse makers, those that are art and those that are not, and then a theory of what explains the difference. There is nothing like that to be found. It is not in that sense. There is nothing like our discussion, contemporary discussion of what is art, what can art do, following from the nature of art. So when we say, there are two different issues here. When you think about the cognitive dimension of art, some conceptual connection between the aesthetic and the cognitive, and how is that? What is amazing? On the other hand, what seems to be to play at stake here, the causal issue. Will consuming art make it better? But the thing is, the supposedly negative effects of engaging with images or with the poetry or whatever they seem to be exactly the same, whether it is art or not art.
Oh, yeah.
So, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, it's like we would have to know something about what constitutes art for this to be the proper sort of conclusions to draw from what Plato says. Maybe one way of thinking, one way of contextualizing this is he's responding to a particular problem at the same time. So another thing, okay, connected to this. Are we going to be Platonic about moral knowledge? See, if I have moral knowledge, and that's enough for me to be a moral human being, or will we say no, something else is required? Because if moral knowledge cannot deliver goods, why would knowledge from art be especially on the stand, like on the film? It's like we are putting knowledge from art on trial. What if moral knowledge, period? Yeah, So maybe I hope I made my point there. So okay, I'll do that, and then I get a question.
Just a second, sorry. So again, thank you. 4 questions are great. Yeah, you're absolutely right that the same negative impact can follow even from, let's say, images which are not artistic. But I think that for Plato, the worry was that on the one hand, art was given this educational status that he was trying to demolish, and on the other hand, that he was afraid that it would be the poetical aspect and the aesthetic aspect of language that would give us the additional. And arguably, this is the element that is lacking from those images, which could be detrimental but are not necessarily poetic. So maybe the answer would be somewhere along those lines. But in contemporary discussions, this is usually what theories of fiction take to show that fiction it's wrong, that it is wrong to think about fiction as made up. That there's more truth to fiction than our, let's say, pre-theoretical understanding is, which is then good because it gives further fuel to aesthetic cognitivism. So it's a very complicated question. But one way in which I usually work with this notion is to, when we put art on trial, as you nicely put it, for its incapacity, so to say, to convince people of certain things, I always wonder, well, what about documentaries, right? We all watch documentaries about air pollution, about the wrongness of sugar, of smoking, of alcohol, and we still drink, eat chocolate a lot in my case, So obviously it's just as incapable of adducing change as art is. So I think it's very interesting to explore these differences and similarities in different kinds of representations and which are true. And I think this is something that film scholars have started to do. Nowadays, everyone is concerned with documentaries and with the cognitive power of documentaries. So you are on the right track to point us into that direction, and I think this is something that is now being recognized as let's say the next crucial step. And as for I think this other question, I take it to be even more interesting to me, because I recently started to work a lot on moral knowledge and on whether knowing moral principles is enough to become a better human being. So yeah, it could be that I would think that you are on the right track when you argue that Plato is not being fair to the arts, because it's not obvious that having that philosophers are any better at
Suppose moral knowledge is a necessary condition for moral behavior.
yeah.
Okay, it is a necessary condition, not necessary. So what? Any moral knowledge of any sort.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
Maybe we can make difference between ethical knowledge and moral knowledge here.
How
So
would you-
moral knowledge is for everyone accessible,
Yeah.
and ethical knowledge is more philosophical.
Yeah, the question of whether moral and ethical have the same. But I think that for Plato, I think that the one thing that he was afraid is that art will give us this idea that, at least this is the example that he keeps mentioning, so probably that's what he was concerned with, is that unjust people will be rewarded, that good people will not be rewarded. So I think that's whether or not that is captured by moral knowledge and moral principles. I think the better account would be through moral exemplars, as we just heard. But you are right. There is. It seems that Plato is in a way short-sighted again with respect to how artists, as opposed to philosophers, having kind of insight into the kind of moral knowledge.
It's like it exhausts the role of art. Okay, let's contrast representation with expression, if you want. So it's like it exhausts everything. It exhausts the role of art and representation. And then the sort of concern that he has, that are the ones you would expect from any censor in any authoritarian regime. People cannot look at this represented because they will take, it's like somehow they will turn into this if they see it represented, or it will shape their minds. It's not like, so in a way it also involves treating others like children.
In terms of Collingwood, as I talked about a couple of days ago, and how Collingwood uses the term magic, it seems like Plato's concerns are with amusement and magic, not with expression, not what Collingwood would say is what we now Collingwood thinks most plausibly mean when we talk about art in the sense of the fine arts or whatnot. But it seems like Plato's concern is also that amusement is always going to be magic. That the emotion that's aroused, the feeling towards the immoral character you enjoy, is not, like that feeling is, you're not going to just enjoy the feeling because it's fun or it adds to the suspense of watching the film if you want to see if the anti-hero is going to get away with it, whatever. But, and so for Collingwood, like the feeling sort of doesn't go beyond the experience of the work or the enjoyment of that itself for amusement, but magic is when the feeling does go beyond the experience of the work and in some ways motivates or influences or inspires practical action of some sort. So it seems like Plato's concern is really that either he wasn't distinguishing between amusement and magic. Whereas Aristotle's theory of catharsis, it seems like he's talking about what Collingwood would call amusement. Or Plato was implying that you can't separate the two, that in effect, how it affects people psychologically, that all amusement is going to be magic, even if that's not the intention of the person who created it.
Yeah.
I don't know if so it's not like Collingwood has to be right. Just like Kant doesn't have to be right either. But we can say it's running out. But no, but I'm wondering if putting it in those terms might help clarify the distinction in your comment.
But now that you mention it, I wonder whether there isn't at least one aspect in which even Collingwood thinks that amusement has because there is a practical, it reverberates, there is an impact on social life. A society that is massively addicted on amusement this will can pervade the social life in a way. It's not just like catharsis. I enjoy just the experience. It's there. It doesn't bleed into the rest of my life. But he thinks that, in fact, this is even interpretive noise in trying to understand this theory, because when you think bad art, the effects of bad art, because we instinctively identify bad art with amusement as the worst example of amusement. But he doesn't mean bad amusement or even really cheap, lousy amusement is not what he means by bad art. Bad art is a specific sort of cognitive failure. So, and when it is successful, that's a bit of that. When you think in point of interest, you cannot have the sort of negative effects that Plato, they will pertain to certain kinds of representation, like magic and amusement. Okay.
But I think, this is an interesting question, but probably for philosophers more so, because I don't think that the, let's say, regular viewer wonders about, am I experiencing the true work of art or just an amusing work? When they are, let's say, taken in by something, they just do accept the views. And, just take any regular example. If you read a lot of Houellebecq's novels, one of the dominant themes is an aging body is by default ugly, it cannot arouse sexual desire, these people are terribly lonely, etc., etc. And obviously there are different levels to that. But if you come up with this idea of an aging body is disgusting, this is obviously a belief that you form that can be very harmful to you in a way, because you may, fail to enjoy sexuality, let's say, in older age. You may fail to appreciate the vulnerability of aging people, etc., etc. So a relatively not necessarily excessively immoral example, but just something that can really influence your life and your perspective. And I think these are the sort of problems that Plato was concerned with. Like, what if we formulate just a harmful beliefs about aging bodies, about older people, about women, about men, about homosexuals, these sorts of things, right?
And the concern seems to be with fiction or representation in general, and not necessarily with what we would call art today.
Yeah, but
with those elements of things that we would count as art fiction. I haven't read Houellebecq, but
just take any example, which again, it doesn't have to be like.
You were saying, it sounds as if he is not necessarily endorsing that view that aging bodies are ugly and not sexually, like can't be sexually desirable. But it sounds like he is sort of holding up that view and maybe representing people who would take that view towards themselves or maybe towards others as a way of asking the reader to almost examine that idea. And that would be more in line with, like, a reader who engages with it in that way, from what you might call a more critical perspective, is more in line with what Conley would call engaging with an expression. So then, if a reader reads it and does sort of come to accept that belief, it's like they're not reading the book properly or critically. They're not reading it or engaging with it as art. They're engaging with it as one would engage with an amusing representation.
Yeah, but again, I don't think that people necessarily make this distinction between amusing and like true representation. But I think this is more interesting from the perspective that you were opening up, and that has to do with the true interpretation. I definitely think that Houellebecq is definitely thinking that the aging body is just the worst thing that can happen to you, and it's unavoidable, obviously, and that's why we don't necessarily suffer. But then my perspective is, if you read that and if you really believe that he's giving you a true depiction, then this can be potentially harmful for the way, particularly, and again, this is Houellebecqian view, but particularly from the point of view of men, who are kind of usually aging a bit better than females. So the idea that men will find younger and the marriage will break because of that. So I'm using this example just because I think it's a very vivid example where we don't necessarily have to use the example of moral monsters like anti-heroes or moral exemplars, which are usually very boring. And just a very something that is, a very an element of human life that we cannot avoid. And I think this is a good example of where you can really harm yourself and your spouse and people around you if you really formulate it. So I'm very hopeful that you are right when you say that readers will critically address this rather than just.
I
think
don't
that
know if they will, or how many of them will. But the ones that don't aren't really reading it as art or apprehending it as art, but they're using it for something. I don't know if anyone is going to be likely to say like leave their spouse or a younger partner because they were convinced by something they read in a novel, when they wouldn't do that anyway. Like I don't think we need that for older men to find younger women more attractive than women their age. Like, that's
well, there's evidence that people would do that. And again, from my research on anti-heroes, there is this huge, but like really frighteningly huge number or great amount of people who repeatedly side with the bad protagonist and think, for example, I know you haven't seen it, but probably some of you did, those people who watched Breaking Bad. Like Walter White is the capital of being bad.
Are
And
they
yet,
going out and dealing drugs, or are they just wearing a hat?
no, this isn't the drug part, but he's basically treating his wife in a very nasty manner at some point in the show. But it was the actress in the real life who was getting death threats by fans who thought that she was being, pardon my language, I'm quoting, a nasty bitch. So this, I think and again, it's not one or two people, it's like the huge community of fans thinking that this actress should be kind of killed.
That's like the example of the aesthetic idiot. That's not the term that's used. So, like the person who is in a play watching Hamlet and runs on stage because they think the murder is real. Like that's.
I don't think that your analogy works. Obviously, some people
Well,
would
the
say
actress
that
is to blame for something the character does. That's just.
there are
I
people
don't think
who
that's a
claim
sign
that.
of something. Yeah, that's something. Like lines are being crossed, but I think but that's a sign of something social and psychological.
But
other
okay,
than
even
just
if you don't, and I agree with you. Yeah, there is something. But even if you don't take that, just the mere fact that even within the fictional world, they would find the wife character to be the morally guilty one and not Walter is disturbing enough, right? So people like Margaret Waage or Emily Nussbaum, they would argue that these are not the intended audience. And I can agree with that, but it's still disturbingly huge number of people who find this moral element.
And is the fiction presenting her as bad but in an ironic way? Or are these people who watch the story and judge her to be the bad guy and sympathetic with not the whole bad guy, you know what I mean? And judge her to be wrong in these scenes. Like, is that judgment of theirs influenced by how the show is portraying the wife, even if it's meant to be ironic or in line with the sort of like anti-hero thing? Or are they making that judgment from like their beliefs or something that they're bringing to the fiction from outside of it? Like,
well, obviously the show is intended to keep you sympathizing with the anti-hero, but there are several points in the development of the story when you realize that he has really gone too far and that it should be sanctioned, not only legally, but also that you just cannot accept him anymore. And at this point, most of the audience kind of steps aside, but these people apparently still think that he is on the right. And these are the kind of examples that I think are showing that we are not always, let's say, safeguarded by the fictional element of the story. I don't know whether with respect to Kant, and this is why I really liked in your discussion this morning, when you were kind of bringing our attention to the importance of the correct interpretation of a work. So whether we should, whether the idea would be that we need to always make sure that we know what the work was all about before we talk about the kind of cognitive, because within Kantian framework it seems that we need the correct interpretation only because the genius is kind of guaranteed by the nature that his or her views, just like with Collingwood, would be the correct one. But again, I'm not sure that this kind of reverberates in our overall discussion about these things.
So should I answer that question? I have one more question for you, if it's possible.
Okay.
Just one brief
For the
one.
sake of-
You don't have to answer this, but we can just think about it and we can speak later on. Does Plato's criticism of art, does it give us resources to speculate on the question, what would he think about some contemporary forms of art? For example, conceptual art, when it comes to cognitive value, just that dimension. You don't have to answer, just I wanted to.
No, that's an
You to
interesting
write down.
question. Yeah.
I think there was conceptual art at the time of Plato. That's stunned by Diogenes throwing the chicken over the wall. Yeah, that's
Oh,
a lot
Performance.
of performance art.
but I think with him it was it really was the mimetic element. I think that, and this is why the first David's question was really important on whether we can extend his criticism given the kind of concept of art that he was working with. But I would have the same question for you with respect to Kant. And how can the reflective judgment be engaged in this process of understanding? Or maybe not just conceptual art, maybe just art generally.
Yes, reflective judgment. How to connect this with the concept of art, I'm not sure, because as far as I know, but you more about his theory of art, he doesn't have to say much about interpretation.
Yeah.
And
Unfortunately.
and when he speaks about artworks, he very rarely refers to his theory of free play between understanding and imagination. So I really cannot speculate what would be some Kantian answer to that question. Don't know. Not
Yeah,
sure.
it is a shame that he didn't say more about interpretation and such. What can I continue with Kant's work? So what would you, within your framework, productive imagination or just imagination as such, how would that relate to our capacity to do the test of categorical imperative? Do you think it is
Oh, that is a very good question.
in that thinking?
I was thinking about that.
Yes.
I was thinking about how to expound use of productive imagination in moral domain. As far as I know, he was not talking about this, but what is application of categorical imperative? What is the test of universalization? It's like thought experiment. So just imagine how would world look like if everyone was inclined to lie, whatever he doesn't have another, he cannot escape some situation or something. So just to generalize that your maxim, your intention, what would it be? You need productive imagination for that. I think it is not easy, so can't believe in human powers. But it is not that easy. We can imagine different scenarios. So it's very important, cognitive power, practical.
It's interesting that art can precisely sometimes give you, I think, this idea of categorical imperative. How would the world be if certain other elements are? So in that sense, productive imagination, I think, does relate to reflective judgment in that. And also just with respect to art appreciation, what I really
Yes,
like.
of course, fiction scenarios are, we can understand them as thought experiments. So all possible worlds.
So my question would be for Mike. I really like your presentation, although it's not really a big question because I don't understand that enough to.
Nobody does, no.
I'd like to, as it's a work in progress. So I was wondering, from what I could remember from the classes that I had on Kant, from what I can remember, he focused mostly on the idea of natural beauty.
Natural beauty, yeah.
Instead of
Unfortunate.
Yeah, instead of
Especially
art.
the first part, analytical, beautiful.
Exactly, and the idea of art was mostly discussed in the context of the art was a product of genius minds, right? So I was wondering if that had any impact on your research, this focus, or if it's not relevant.
This focus
On natural beauty instead of.
and because of that we don't have enough answers.
Okay.
So interesting. I wanted to say something about our appreciation of art in that staying in that framework, but change it a little bit.
It is interesting because there are questions. It's questionable whether his theory of natural beauty can easily relate to his theory about. And what you presented on your first talk, when you mentioned this difference between aesthetic judgment with respect to natural beauty, which is free, or at least Kant sees it as free, though there are of course problems with ornithologists, etc. And artistic beauty, which is adherent beauty. So it could be that there are two precisely different accounts that we need to. So you are on
But
the
the
right.
very distinction between free beauty and adherent beauty is so right. It depends on your knowledge.
Yeah.
What is, how to say, exotic in nature depends on your knowledge,
See,
your experience.
if fine art, if a defining characteristic of fine art in this case is representational art, that's what we would consider. We would not consider fine art when it's not representational. So so beauty for in that case is always is never free beauty, but added beauty. What are the arts that are able to be the bearers of free beauty? Those that have no cognitive import, like the way you saw for instrumental music.
Instrumental music.
And the agreeable arts, you employ this distinction that fine arts and the agreeable arts. The agreeable arts have free beauty. So what's on the side of the genuinely fine art, only added beauty, because it all depends on conceptual and also representations, things that are culturally situated, I would say. I mean, it's just that's correct. But that was not the question. It's not a question. I was going back to those Polka and different approaches to free play.
It's precognitive.
Yeah, precognitive, exactly, that typology. So, and in a way, it made me say, we have this model of the cognitive judgment. Okay? You apply a concept, there's a synthesis, and then there's a right answer. This is a cat. This is whatever. Okay. So, and when we think about, and I think this is how at least Peter Keeley seems to think about that question in his book, The Lustig Books, like if you want to be realists about the properties of artworks and make them valuable, there will be a right answer for what's there. But not okay. Try to think of the sort of properties described by Nelson Goodman's symptoms of the aesthetic, and to think them as they are genuinely there. Like it's dense. It's a certain type of representations that are dense, replete, complex, multiple reference, exemplification or metaphorical exemplification, etc. There will not be one single answer. So the sort of cognitive exercise that you have to do to understand these representations particularly, which differ from representations of science, do you see a connection there with free play in a way that's relevant for art, not just for natural beauty, which is like definitely in which we are all the same regardless of cultural background. So this was what I thought.
So ascribing those properties.
Yeah. Well, like
So
this sort of
let's say
imagine.
this painting is
Imagine here's how Goodman sees things. So that there is this subclass of representations which are not defined as it's not necessary artificial conditions, but like they are characterized by symptoms, the symptoms of the aesthetic. Okay, they are dense, complete, etc. So what you have to do when you have to understand these sorts of representations. And I think if you see a connection there of the notion of free play in the sense that especially the later category by Bulgaria, that you rehearse several
concept that
you're not
second
making
one
you're not making the sentences, you're not making them okay, this, you know what I mean, like you're rehearsing perspectives. So what I'm asking is, isn't this more enlightening when you try to understand what this free play is all about? I don't know.
So if I understood properly, so ascribing property, for example, there is a painting, so it could be vivid, or some element could be graceful, some water lily, graceful, this painting, or whatever, it could be dynamic. We can use Kendall Bolton's example, Guernica, could be dynamic,
violent, dynamic,
disturbing maybe, if this is aesthetic property at all. So it could be true to life or not, you know. So in ascribing those properties.
What distinguishes aesthetic properties from what are not?
So the role of free play in this process of ascribing aesthetic properties, if I understood correctly, is that the question? I really don't know, because we need categories for this.
Sorry?
Aesthetic concepts, categories.
Yeah.
So Kant only mentions two kind of aesthetic values: beautiful and sublime, beauty and sublime.
Yeah.
So I don't know for more substantive properties.
I would use the sense of static judgments.
And I have to apply those concepts, but I think that we are applying concept of beauty when we judge this is beautiful. It is not. It's just. So he can, for example, accept Frank Sibley's view of aesthetic concepts, because his view is also anti-essentialist. It's not rule following. I agree with that. But the positive role of free play, of understanding and imagination in the process of ascribing aesthetic properties, which can be related to interpretation then. When I say this painting is like this, it has this set of properties, it's something similar to interpretation, pertains to that. So, but it depends actually whether the property is evaluative or more descriptive, but I'm not sure. I cannot speculate that far.
Alan Goldman has an interesting theory about the level of descriptive properties, perceptual, descriptive, evaluative, and artistic. So how do the two relate? But yeah, Frank Sibley is.
So it's interesting connection between aesthetic and artistic properties. Artistic properties, but I don't know what would be.
Soon
I will tell you in a few weeks if that suits you.
Because I tend to be. I was impressed by James Gunn's argument in Less Dubrovnik, that we tend to, because violence is not. I had this discussion in example in his backyard. Is that I'm not so sure that those properties that Walton talks about earlier is no, it's not Walton. It's one example of Walton in the footnote, which I often quote, which is the bust, the marble bust, and the general bust, bust of the Roman general, serene. But then if I with another category, I could see it as a dissected human body, so I would not see it as serene, something like that. These apples are not aesthetic properties. What we are inclined to call certain the Ziblian predicates, because it was the vocabulary used by art critics in the Ziblian style, and then we read simply when we read it, so that becomes like a paradigm of mind. But do we really have a firm grasp on what determines that violence is not aesthetic but graceful is? I'm not sure. Today, I don't know.
And what is the demarcation line between aesthetic and non-aesthetic? It sometimes
I think
we can use just some word aesthetically, even though it's not aesthetic. When we say something is sad music, it's not literal usage of the word. At least partly metaphorical, because sadness is human feeling. It's not for music. What does it mean? Does it mean it expresses sadness or induces sadness or represents sadness?
I tend towards the idea that expression is a kind of representation. It's not the whole representation, it's a kind of expresses sadness. It cannot be the fact that it makes me sad, because I can be really sad by music that I will not discover sad. And music, very joyful, and music can make me angry. So I would not put it in positive. It's true.
I guess a question of clarification. If you could clarify something that was both in this talk and the talk on Wednesday, and then there were two other things, but maybe I'll ask this first and save it for later. There were two things you mentioned in the talk today that I would just be interested in you whether to say more about or expand on. But the clarification question is just so I've only heard the term meta-aesthetic recently, like in the last year or so. Maybe a little bit before that, but there was only one person, and then it was directly.
That is strange.
It was used as a direct parallel to meta-ethics. So in that case, I think it was Alex King, who normally works in meta-ethics. But I think that's probably when I first heard the term meta-aesthetic. It seemed like a direct parallel, and I think she was using it just like if you could broadly consider meta-ethic as like looking at what we mean by or the logic of claims or statements about ethical right and wrong. She was doing that with talking about claims of like aesthetic goodness or badness. That didn't seem exactly how you were using the term today, meta-aesthetic. And in the talk on Wednesday night today, you said that. And so I guess, so the first part is how exactly are you using the term meta-aesthetic, or what do you mean by that? And then, quite tied to that, from the first talk you gave, I was trying to understand why it is that thinking that judgments of taste can have truth values. If someone thinks that a judgment can have truth value, why is that enough to make them count as what you call the meta-aesthetic cognitiveness? Because if meta-aesthetic does parallel with meta-ethic, it seems like what the person who thinks that a judgment of taste has truth value would be is maybe, I still don't know what meta-aesthetic means, but a meta-aesthetic realist, because in the meta-ethical sense, just an aesthetic realist, because in the meta-ethical analogy, if someone thinks that an ethical claim, like X is morally good, has a truth value, then that would make them an ethical realist, not an ethical cognitivist. So I get, what does meta-aesthetic mean, and why are we making that link to cognitivism?
Yes. There is a great mess in this literature. Sometimes authors use this expression, realist, anti-realist, ontologically, sometimes epistemologically. But because of that, what I understand as meta-ethic cognitivism, that is just epistemological or semantic epistemological claim, the judgments of taste that they have truth value, like real propositions. So maybe we cannot give a proof for some of them, but there are real propositions, not expressions of attitudes, of emotions, not prescriptions, but not a combination of those things, just real proposition. For example, when I say Hitler is moral monster, that is a proposition. Yeah. And of course, they should be a fact, like the truth maker. Yeah. And there is a fact. At least some cases are clear. Mm-hmm. So, and that means that relativists are not right. At least some, according to my intuition, at least some cases are. Mm-hmm. Maybe there is some gray field, but at least some cases, a case like this. And that makes one meta-aesthetic cognitivist. And what is meta-aesthetic anti-realism or realism? that is the ontological plane, that moral facts exist or not, moral properties exist or not, on the different levels. So cognitivism, both metaethical and metaesthetical, would be on an epistemic level or epistemological level, and realism, anti-realism on ontological levels. And sometimes, and that it seems to be that is with Kant's theory, and because of that it's a bit incoherent. So we should find way out of this.
Okay, so then you're not using the term
So
cognitive.
he is metaesthetic cognitivist, because I think that follows from the thesis that judgments of taste are universally valid. If they're universally valid, they should be true, real propositions, true statements. So on the other side, he claims that beauty is not a property of a thing. So what is truth maker then? So I suggested several possible contemporary solutions for this. And at the end, I think that third moment can give us some the ideal form of proposiveness of a thing, if we understand that as a property. So it's a bit revisionary. It's not an interpretation, but a revision. If we understand that as a dispositional property, as a power of that intuition to elicit free play. So that would be, if that answers.
Then am I right in thinking that you're using the word cognitivist in the sense not to mean that art can be a source of knowledge we can learn
No,
from?
that is aesthetic. Maybe I was not clear. That is aesthetic cognitivism. So a completely different thing.
Okay, so-
That is the thesis that art can have cognitive value, that we can learn a lot from art, and that
Yeah, it could be ethical, cognitivist about aesthetic judgments in general, that you can still defend that we learn from art.
yes, of course.
It's like, okay, I apply graceful, delicate, whatever to all sorts of things. Also to art works, but okay, it's one thing to think that when I say X is graceful, there's a certain connection between this and the world mediated by composition,
Yes.
on all that machinery. Another thing is to learn from art,
Yes.
whether or not that involves.
Yes, and it was prima facie. It looks like separate thesis.
Yeah.
Completely
Okay, so I just
separate.
want-
But I
just
was
to make sure that-
interesting
Just to
in
make sure
connection.
Just to make sure that I've understood, then by meta-aesthetic cognitivism, you just mean that, like that's the position that aesthetic judgments are cognitive judgments.
No.
No.
Just real propositions. And for Kant, I mentioned that at one point. For him, it is very important to make distinction between aesthetic judgments, pure aesthetic judgments, and cognitive judgments. In his usage of a word, what are cognitive, theoretical, logical judgments? Epistemology is different. When it comes to aesthetic judgments, judging is non-inferential. Judging is by acquaintance, as you said in some other context. Just I have to encounter a work of art in order to feel that disinterested pleasure in the art. Cognitive judgment, this is a cat, as you said, so I'm subsuming. They're not
Yeah, so it's not like, I'm just not understanding.
I'm
Maybe
sorry,
it's not
I'm sorry,
important
I wasn't
why
explicit.
a judgment being a proposition and having a truth value, why call that cognitive?
That is just like in meta-ethical cognitivism.
Was that the term in meta-ethics?
Yes.
And
But
that
we don't
seems
have,
that-
unfortunately, we
that
don't
seems
have
strange.
established meta-aesthetics as a philosophical
Yeah, yeah.
subdiscipline, and it is we
Okay, but
beginnings
it's
of
not cognitive.
ethics in the 18th century and beginnings of aesthetics in ancient times. That is interesting. Why? Why is the explanation of this?
But I think that the
Yeah.
relevant, the reason why it's called cognitivism is that, as you said, they want to make sure that this is a judgment rather than emotional expression or emotional reaction. That's why it's called. But yeah, you're right. It has nothing to do with the kind of debates on cognitivism that we have been
So,
discussing.
if I can add something, as you see, Kant's aesthetics, it has at least just broadly two parts. It was always easier to me to understand it, like analytic part, like in contemporary analytic aesthetics. What is specific for those judgments, aesthetic judgments? in comparison to judgments of agreeable on one side and cognitive judgments or moral judgments, because moral judgments are broadly cognitive as well, on the other side. So this is the first, analytical beauty. And more substantive questions about art, about beauty on the object level. So, and sometimes I call this speculative part because of those ideas, beauty as a symbol of morality or ideal of beauty also belongs, 17th paragraph also belongs to the second part, ideal of beauty as an expression of morality on a human face. So I think that belongs to more substantive questions at an object level and pertains to aesthetic cognitivism. The first part is dealing like Kant is our contemporary aesthetician about very judgments. It's very contemporary.
Yeah. Maybe there's a mismatch or disanalogy then between the aesthetic and the ethical.
Maybe.
There, because so I've heard ethical cognitivism refer to what you're explaining. I haven't heard meta-ethical cognitivism. I haven't heard that be called meta-ethical cognitivism. Although obviously the question of whether ethical judgments are cognitive or not is a meta-ethical question. But then there doesn't seem to be an equivalent in ethics of aesthetic cognitivism. Like no one really talks about whether you can learn from
moral theory or something. Yeah?
Like in that
So
in that sense.
Kant can believe that you can learn a lot from his moral. On the other side, it's fact of your understanding, categorical imperative, but you can learn a lot. It depends whether you are particularist or generalist. And it is strange. It is strange that Kant was ethical generalist while aesthetical particularist. So it's completely different mechanism epistemologically. So what is that? Maybe there is some explanation.
Maybe an analogous question would be, do you learn from examples? Something like that. Right? And then you can ask, just like you ask whether the AI count as testimony, because the artworks count as examples. I think that trying to grab
That is very interesting. Ethical cognitivism, what that would be. Was Aristotle, for example, an ethical cognitivist or not? Can you learn something from his theory? Even though I think that we can learn a lot, even though there is no one single norm or rule, like categorical imperative. Thank you.
Paint a figure on that as well. About the truth maker of aesthetic judgments. If aesthetic judgments are true propositions, right? According to the framework, what is the truth maker that gave true or the false?
It sounds strange, but there are aesthetic facts. There are aesthetic properties, but those properties are yes.
What grounds that?
Yes. But those properties are not like, when I say this table is rectangular, it's an inherent property or primary quality of the thing. When I say this wall is a bit yellowish or white, it isn't. Maybe it's white. This wall is white. It's another kind of property, secondary quality. So when I say this is beautiful, or this is graceful, or this is vivid, am I ascribing a property here or not? I think the answer is positive. I ascribe a property, but that property is maybe Gestalt property. Maybe it's supervenient property. It supervenes on some combination of different non-aesthetical properties. And that supervenience is anomical. So this is completely Sibley way of understanding. But it exists.
According to Kant, you cannot assess we have an epistemic problem because we cannot access to facts.
Yes. Yes. Actually.
So we cannot access to the aesthetical facts.
Yes.
So
We don't have standard of taste. We don't, what do you mean standard of taste?
The distinction between the judgments of the legal and judgments of taste is basically the normative expectation. And
Yes.
I am, but where should I make a little bit.
Okay.
Prejudice is invested, and then you have the expectation of normativity. And also, I demand. What's the German expression where it's it can be the force? Because I demand from you.
Yes.
But can that expectation ground
So the
the
fact,
property?
the fact is this expectation about.
So it's a creation that we made, like that. It's a construction that we made. We create things with our categories of understanding.
So, but what would be the standard? What would be a criteria if it's not just formulated a rule like principle like categorical imperative here? If you say this is beautiful and I say this is not beautiful, how can we know who is right and who is wrong? So maybe Hume's aesthetics is answer. Standard of taste is joint judgment of good critics. It's like virtue ethics.
But there's
Agent-centered.
also the assumption that here we are, okay, was the ideal critics. I mean, we maximize our virtues to we all very discriminating, conceptually and conceptually. We all have good judgment, good sense, blah, blah, blah. We've seen a lot of examples of things we're judging, different examples, contrasting categories, whatever, we do all that. But there's this assumption, if we do all that, we are going to arrive at some judgment. But the thing is, it's singular. That's why I mentioned Goodman's sentence. Because if you treat Goodman's sentence as objective properties of the object, okay, they tell you, okay, no, even the ideal critics may arrive at this similar judgment. And not in the sense that Aristotle doesn't matter, so it's cognitively, how they call the blameless, something like that.
Oh, disagreement.
Blameless disagreement.
This is very actually possible. Like two persons, they're looking at the Genex Tower in Belgrade or some other more elitist building. One says, "Oh my God, it's ghastly," and the other says, "No, it's beautiful." Then they engage in this conversation, and then they start to they mention properties, and then one tries to explain to the other, "Why do you see it that? What do you mean beautiful?" Okay? And imagine you're at this point. I thought, it's ghastly. I see your point. I can understand why someone would see it as beautiful, and vice versa. Okay? In this scenario, what property is beauty? Because I think when we make aesthetic judgments, we are studying properties. But the way I tend to think about it, okay, let me take this example that's used by Goodman in his response to Donald Davidson about metaphors. In the particular case at hand, it's an example used by James Stanley in this pre-prolonged musical expression. The Alpine lake is spheric. No, actually, consider the metaphor. The lake is a sapphire. Am I ascribing the property? What's there? What's working there? Okay. There are many properties that sapphires and lakes have. Being blue, iridescent, coruscant, etc., etc., etc. And when I say the lake is a sapphire, okay, how could I translate this into the language of properties? The lake is spheric. Do I need to ontologically there is this property that is spheric? No, actually, when I make a metaphor, it's a way. Okay, maybe you're right. It's a Gestalt thing. It's an epistemic Gestalt. I'm organizing the properties or the thing as. Okay, it's blue, it's iridescent, it's coruscant, etc. But do I need an extra thing, which is the sphericness of it, like an ontological layer on top of over and above being blue, being this and that?
Yes.
So
So,
could beauty work like this? Could we already have a good, like,
so you
What
were
am I
asking
doing?
whether we can reduce beauty to some more basic,
back to say
non-aesthetic.
policy kindness? It's really, it's why it's good to be looked at. And you have to, okay, but I would,
I think that at the end, because it's an ontological question, who knows? We cannot give a proof or some conclusive argument for this, but the best argument is our cognitivistic intuition at the end. And you mentioned two things which are relevant here: cognitive uniformity.
Yeah.
Last time you mentioned that a priori element in judgment of taste is that expectation or that
Yeah.
normative demand. I think that is secondary a priori element. The first one is cognitive uniformity. Kant's idea of cognitive structure. We all have all those cognitive powers: imagination, judgment of taste. Not judgment of taste, power of judgment, and all others. So we are cognitively uniform, and that is epistemologically very, very important. But there are those scenarios in which two elites, for example, equally sensitive, equally educated, can split. So, and there were some examples in the history of art for that. And just, well, we don't have time to go there, but just to mention the other thing you mentioned a few minutes ago, critical reasons. When I say, for example, and what is the logic of aesthetic evaluation anyway? When I say Anna Karenina is an excellent book, is a masterpiece, and you say no, nothing special, just commonplace. So, if I am able to give relevant, adequate reasons for this claim, if I say it's morally profound or philosophically profound, if I say characters are individualized or psychologically true to life, so to say.
like the expressions in
And tragical force, for example. Can I make some comparison between Anna Karenina and Antigona, for example, and to find it when I give such good explanation or justification, it would be justification in epistemological terms, justification of my judgment. That means something. Of course, those reasons should be, even though those reasons are not generalizable. If you're not aesthetic generalist, if you don't believe in canons, in some norms, if they're true, if they're relevant, if they're interpretatively acceptable, so that is the best we have. So we should accept a bit of relativism in this field, but that doesn't mean that everything is relevant.
According to your description, it seems that there is some like joint acceptance or joint action to some kind of judgments that people do. So there is a coordination
Between people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is also, and also diachronically, the test of time.
Oh, yeah.
The test of time. There is
considered.
Humean idea, basically.
Yeah. I mentioned this about when John Robson was the Van Meeken forgeries of Vermeer. So nowadays, a lay person regarding painting can look at Van Meeken and intuitively see what's wrong. Okay? And yet, all those decades ago, we fooled the expert, the best candidates to the second best thing to the true critic. Okay? It took a long time.
Yes. And there are also examples like this. Tolstoy, for Shakespeare, he has that very hard criticism in his, I think that is the paper, on Shakespearean drama, something like that. And he criticizes Macbeth, King Lear. So it's not very, very bad. His opinion was not favorable at all. So what does it mean? And he also has some justifications, like huge quotes from Shakespeare plays. And he's definitely authority, definitely a good critic. What to say? Is it a tragedy or something?
Was he a good critic if he was excluding things that should not be excluded? Or should we have to revise our opinion about his being a good critic?
Or just maybe we should.
I mean,
I'm just judging from his works.
Yeah.
I just maybe that is naive. So his books, you don't like Tolstoy.
You can be a good novelist but a bad critic. The two don't necessarily.
yeah, I could.
Not necessarily. But his understanding of human nature in different works, in Anna Karenina.
You can. It's more. His case is more like Saint Augustine's case.
He
Nothing.
Oh, well, just quickly, yeah, because his own critical judgment in his book What Is Art discounts the works of his own works that we would think of as the greatest. And it's like he only ends up thinking that he's written two good pieces of literature. One was a short story, and I think one was the last book, Resurrection, I think. But he discounts Anna Karenina. So Tolstoy, as the critic, doesn't think Anna Karenina is a good work of art. Or War and Peace.
That's why it's kind of like Saint Augustine. He has this appreciation for classical culture. Well, writes beautifully, but then he has this qualms. Oh my God, he's feeling pleasure of the ear. So, no, it's not like this. And then we should reject this art because it doesn't show the revolution. And that's the good art. We should be accepting and embracing that because something like that.
Yeah, the psychological explanation.
The Plato syndrome. This is going to lead people's faith. This is going to
The psychological explanation is simplistic if you're reductive. I do think it's probably true to at least some extent that Tolstoy felt guilty about being an aristocrat. And that motivates. Like, you can't reduce everything to just that explanation, but I think that's part of what was going on there. And it's motivating one of his concerns.
Yeah, that's not probably the best stuff. Thank you.